So welcome everyone to the speaker series, Women Peacemakers Before and After 1325. Welcome to the conversation with Monica McWilliams, in the discussion with her exceptional expertise on women, peace and security. This conversation is part of the learning process on the role of women peacemakers globally. I'm Raja Telli, Senior Fellow at Center for Peace and Conflict Study. The opening remark will be delivered by the representative of the sponsors of the event, the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University and the United Nations Association of the USA, UNA-USA, and Inclusive Security. We will start the opening remark with Associate Dean Elizabeth Helbom, and I'm going to give to say her bio. Associate Dean Elizabeth Helbom is Associate Dean Director, Fushino Leadership Institute. Associate Dean Helbom is a member of the Senior Leadership Team and the School Board of Advisors. She serves as the Chief Officer, leading design, implementation, and strategic assessment activities in the following area: external affairs, administration, strategy, and leadership. Dean Helbom leads all major events and activity of the school, including the school's World Leaders Forum, fundraising goals, and concerts. Please, Dean Helbom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Raja. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Thank you for sharing in this important dialogue. The School's Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, along with our partners, the United Nations Association of the USA and Inclusive Security, have engaged us in a rich discussion of the assets, challenges, and shortfalls to UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security from various perspectives around the world. The series has brought women peacemaker experts from the Middle East, from the US, from Africa, from South America, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from Ms. McWilliams today from her experience in Northern Ireland. The questions and ideas generated by this dialogue are moving the conversation forward, and I believe will have an impact on the role of women in the peace process. So I want to thank the Center for making this dialogue possible. I want to thank all of our guests for being with us today, for our sponsors, and for Raja for pushing this conversation. My pleasure to be here with you today. I look forward to participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dean Helbom. Now I'd like to introduce Paula Boland, UNA-USA National Council Chair and the President of UNA-USA National Capital Area Chapter. Paula Boland is an attorney specialized in environmental law and international affairs. Paula worked on regularity and corporate compliance matters at the law firm of Klein and Franco in Buenos Aires. She graduated cum laude from the LLM program in environmental law at Vermont Law School, following a clerkship with the Environmental Enforcement Section of the U.S. Department of Justice. Paula assisted of a number of environmental non-governmental organizations in the development of conservation projects to be carried out in Latin America. Paula joined the UNA-NCA staff, serving first as program director and then as executive director. Paula received the UNA-NCA Evelyn Falkowski Volunteer Service Award and the United Nations Association of the USA 70th Anniversary Chapter Legacy Award. Paula serves as the regional representative of the UNA-USA National Council. Paula, the floor is yours. Please, the welcoming remark on behalf of UNA-USA.
Thank you. On behalf of the United Nations Association of the USA, I would like to welcome everyone and thank each of you for participating today. Special thanks to our Seton Hall partners, Associate Dean Elizabeth Helbom, Raja, Atali and your team, and Ambassador Swani Han, representing Inclusive Security. We are very proud of the long-standing partnership collaboration between Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and UNA-USA, which demonstrates our commitment to providing opportunities to explore global issues, challenges, and solutions, as well as developing more informed and better equipped global citizens who can play a role in making this world a better place for everyone, everywhere. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with UNA USA, we're a grassroots movement of over 20,000 members who convene in over 200 campus and community chapters across the US. We are dedicated to educating, inspiring, and mobilizing Americans to support the principles and the vital work of the United Nations and its agencies, as well as to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council formally acknowledged, through the creation of Resolution 1325, the changing nature of warfare, in which civilians are increasingly targeted and women continue to be excluded from participation in peace processes. The resolution specifically addresses how women and girls are disproportionately impacted by violent conflict and war, and recognizes the critical role that women can and already do play in peace-building efforts. The resolution affirms that peace and security efforts are more sustainable when women are equal partners in the prevention of conflict, the delivery of relief and recovery efforts, and in forging lasting peace. Women are central to peace processes, and they get results. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how it exposed the profound inequalities at the root of many conflicts. When women are fully represented in peace and political processes, we have a chance for peace and for sustainable development. However, and despite progress being made, after 20 years since the adoption of this resolution, we still do not see enough implementation. Accepting women at the peace negotiating tables is still a gap in many countries. And civil society plays a critical role in advocating for inclusive and equitable representation of women in peace processes. At UNA USA, we elevate women, peace, and security issues through our UNA Women Affinity Group, educational programs like this one, partnerships, and much more, including our advocacy with members of Congress and the administration. We also inform our communities and volunteer with organizations that support women and girls. If you'd like to participate in our network and activities, I encourage you to visit unausa.org and get actively involved. Once again, thank you very much for your participation today. I hope you enjoy Ms. McWilliams' talk on the implications of women, peace, and security in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula Boland. And now I will move to Ambassador Swanee Hunt, who will be giving the welcoming remark on behalf of Inclusive Security. Swanee Hunt is the founder of the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard University. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Hunt represented President Bill Clinton as ambassador to Austria, where she hosted negotiations to stop the genocide in the neighboring Balkan states. Ambassador Hunt has worked in 60 countries with thousands of women leaders. She is founder of the Institute for Inclusive Security, a major force in the field of women, peace, and security. Her bold goal is changing who makes decisions about war and peace. She has authored columns and articles for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, CNN, and provided commentary for numerous television networks. Her 4 books deal with foreign policy drawn from the Bosnian War, as well as Rwanda women's role in healing their country after horrific genocide. Ambassador Hunt, the floor is yours. You are muted, Ambassador Hunt.
I unmuted and it muted again. I think that's a sign. Okay, but I will tell me if it happens again. Okay, and I don't know who can see me or not. There was some back and forth when we were trying to set up. So let me just tell people I'm wearing a sort of beautiful shirt of my mother's, and there's a picture of Hillary behind me. You can interpret that however you want. So Monica, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be doing other things. And I said, hey, world, stop spinning. I want to be with Monica McWilliams. So here I am. And I'll change anything just to be with you. I adore you. I'm sorry. I'm doing a tribute to Monica McWilliams. So let me go back. And inclusive security probably wouldn't exist without Monica McWilliams. You don't know this, Monica, but it's true. There's an idea, right? But then there has to be inspiration. And you were one of the people who gave me that inspiration. Roger was saying
We are not able to hear you, Ambassador Hunt, now.
What's the last thing you heard, Raja?
Raja was saying, this is what you said. This is what I heard. You said Monica is inspirational, like the idea exists. Monica is inspirational. Raja said, and I didn't hear after that.
Okay. Well, Raja was saying that I've worked in 60 countries. And in 61 of those 60 countries, I've talked about Monica McWilliams, because inclusive security would not exist without Monica McWilliams, and she doesn't know that. That's why I changed what I was supposed to be doing today so I could be here. People ask about the name, and by the way, I was asked to come to Harvard by Joe Nye, who was the dean, and he was coming up with this idea of soft power. And he wanted to figure out if there was something about women that was related to soft power. And he really believed that was true. And of course, he ended up being right. The reason I wanted to be here is I think, Monica, in just thinking about today, it brought so much back about why we chose the name inclusive security, for example, because we have an office here in DC. We work with policymakers. And people think of us doing women's empowerment, which is not what we do. What we do is think about how do you stop war, right? How do you stop the violent conflict? And you got to do it inclusively. And who's not at the table? Women. And I don't think women need empowering, by the way. I think we have the power internally. I mean, in terms of who we are, there's structural problems. And that policymakers who decide who's going to be at the table, they're the ones who need to learn something. The women, with women have our lives figured out pretty well. So, so we called it inclusive security. This is pre 1325, a year before 1325. And I thought, well, inclusive makes the point. Well, first of all, in DC, security is your magic word, right? Like, you get funding, you get people's attention if you say security. And the inclusive part, people don't have a clue what you're talking about. So hopefully it piques their interest, right? And so why is it that women play such an important role? It's because we're second-class citizens. How's that? It's a big help. It's a big help to be second-class citizens. It means you can go anywhere. You're not threatening. You can do so much. You just got to make sure that going anywhere includes the negotiating table, right? But when you're on the ground.
One-of-a-kind pieces made by hand, live-in original.
Okay, something's going on with my computer, but I have loved working with you, Raja, and others at Seton Hall, and particularly I want to lift up what the dean said about civil society, or one of you said, because it's back and forth between the two. It's not here's civil society and here's the government, etc. And that Monica McWilliams' career will be an example of that. Her story is fabulous. It's an example that I use over and over about reaching across. But I'll tell you, I mean, there are a lot. And I know. I just keep pressing the mute, the mic button, the unmute. It keeps going back into mute. So Anyway, so Monica's going to tell you what went right, what went wrong. She's going to give us advice. She's going to use her Northern Irish humor. I'll close with one thing. So we're sitting in my kitchen at the table, and we're accidentally, some people's flights got messed up. This is at the very, very beginning. So we're at the table, and one of the women at the table from another country, she said, "Oh, I'm just getting so depressed because there's a conflict going on, a war, blah, blah." And she said, "I'm spending time, my daughter never sees me. I don't think I'm effective. I don't know where my life is going." And Monica is sitting there and she says, "So have you had the death threats yet?" Monica, I tell this story because I get to use my accent, my Northern Irish accent. So, and she said, "The what?" And you said, "The death threats. Our children were getting death threats when they went to school, and so the parents, we made a kind of a line on each side, and so the children could go and not get killed as they're going to the school." You may not have said those exact words, but that was it. And I watched this other woman, and it was really, really interesting. I thought that her head would hit the table at that point. She was all slouched down. And I watched her as she listened to you talking about the death threats, and she got stronger and she got stronger and she got stronger. And all of a sudden she's sitting up, and it was just such a lesson to hear honesty and to feel like there's someone around this table who understands. And that's what we have to do for each other. And we need to help these policymakers. First of all, the women, we need to be the policymakers, let's just face it. And the ones who are sort of Neanderthal about this, we just got to have meetings like this and work together and figure out. That general who told me after I said, "You got to bring women in. We just bombed the hell out of Baghdad, and this is the time you got to get women into the governing council. You got to get in them, there, because blah, 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 blah. Here are all the things they can do for you." And he said, "Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for coming to see me at the Pentagon. And as soon as we get the place secure, we'll tend to women's issues." I said, "I'm not talking about cervical cancer. I'm talking about security." So we got a long way to go. And it's moments like this, Raja. Thank you. And Monica, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hunt. And we want women to be the policymakers. With that, I will move to hosting Monica McWilliams. We are honored to host Monica McWilliams, a signatory of the Good Friday Peace Agreement in Northern Ireland, and was the lead negotiator for Northern Ireland Women Coalition, a political party elected to the multi-party peace talks. Monica McWilliams was elected to the first Northern Ireland Legislative Assembly and appointed as Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission from 2006 to 2011, drafting the advice on a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. Monica McWilliams has done incredible work within the civil society sectors and with supporting women and civil society organizations in different places around the world, like in Syria, with me. She currently serves on the Independent Reporting Commission for the disbandment of parliamentary groups in Northern Ireland, and she is the former chair of InterPeace and an international peace building NGO, and is a Professor Emerita in the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University. She has published widely on the impact of political conflicts on women's life, and her recent memoir, Stand Up, Speak Out, charts her activism over the decades from the civil rights protest in the 1960s to the peace process in Northern Ireland. Monica received of the J.F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. Without further ado, Monica McWilliams, I would like you to enlighten us during this conversation on how we advance the women, peace, and security agenda. You are my first trainer and teacher on negotiation and on women participation in this process. So thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for being with us. The floor is yours. So Monica, you are muted. I cannot hear you.
Because you could, is that better? Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well now.
Okay, because you could hear me earlier. I didn't know who muted me. So it's great to be with you, Raja. And lovely to hear you say that I was your first trainer. And it's sad, though, to know that was over 11 years ago. And when I first met Raja, I had come out of a conflict of 30 years here in Northern Ireland. And you heard that I have written a book in which I say that I became an activist at the age of 15, a civil rights activist, marching and protesting. And feminism had not hit our shores in the late 1960s. And to my shame, I carried a placard that said, "One man, one vote," as I had CS gas and rubber bullets fired at me. And of course, today it would be one person, one vote. But it was 1969. And I tell that story because I thought when I first met Raja in Istanbul and the group, and the war had just started in Syria, that you all thought it would be over quite soon. And I had said I was 15 when I started marching. And the day that I signed the peace agreement, I was 40 years of age. So I never knew peace in all of those years. A war had become normal and peace was abnormal. And in fact, I discovered that some of the people I was negotiating around the table found it easier to make war than they did to make peace. And so it was difficult. But I'm here today to talk to you, and I want to thank you for this invite to Dean Halpin and to Paula from USA, and particularly to Swanee, who I met all those 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, probably nearly 30 years ago now. And long before we ever heard of anyone being a gender champion, which has become the new kind of concept or construct, Swanee was one of those champions. But the most important thing that I got from Swanee was kindness and compassion. At a time when I felt very lonely, when many of us living in conflict don't have contacts with the outside world. And Swanee was the first to bring us to the United States. It was called Women Waging Peace back then. And boy, were we doing that, waging and weaving. And I came home with my batteries recharged. And it was lovely to hear that story. I'd forgotten. I didn't even know I'd said that. But part of that was reaching out to other women, women who were tired, as you told that story, of the woman who was exhausted. Because we'd stood at too many graves and we'd watched too many people being buried. And we were determined that if we ever did get a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, that women had given too much not to be at the table. So Swanee, I want to thank you because you gave me confidence and encouragement. And I went from Women Waging Peace to eventually into inclusive security. And I could have pinched myself the day that I was invited by Inclusive Security to address the US Congress Committee on Foreign Affairs, where we all weaved our stories in front of that very important congressional committee about the importance of inclusive security. And the talk then, as today, was the importance of UN Resolution 1325. And I want to tell the story today of how that resolution came about. But the theme of today's story, and I'll try and keep it all nice and tight, is the importance of women in these roles as negotiators, as mediators. But more importantly, the question that I am often asked is, what difference does it make? And I say all the difference in the world. And that's why I wrote the book, Stand Up, Speak Out. The women in Northern Ireland had put gender on the agenda for decades. We were the people at the interfaces, reaching across when people refused to speak to each other. We were trying to protect our children on both sides from both the armed combatants, the illegal groups, the paramilitary groups, as well as the British soldiers, the British Army that had come in. And because of violence that was raging around us, women decided across the communities that they needed to start a dialogue. And we were engaged in that dialogue long before the formal peace negotiations took place. And so when the ceasefires occurred in 1994, we refused to take a back seat. There were going to be no women at the table. And we looked at the system. And here I want to tell you, systems are important. As Swanee just said, capacity and building capacity is important. And I've done a lot of it, as how all of you have. Empowerment is important. But the structures and the systems have to change. And this was back in 94, 6 years before the UN resolution on women, peace and security. So there was no resolution that was going to get us to the table. But we just refused to recognize a system that was so exclusionary, that was going to only allow the armed groups and the constitutional parties to be at that table. And when we got organized, they said, where did these women come from? As if we'd fallen out of the sky. We've been around for 25 years, and this is the first important point I want to make, is we had the networks in place, the pre-existing networks, but we hadn't been recognized as having these. And when the elections were declared, we said, these parties, 10 parties that are going to be at the table, we could build on those networks. We could form a coalition. And that's in fact what we did. 6 weeks before the day of the election, we got organized. We planted the advertisements in the papers. We brought the women to the meetings. We called meetings all over the country. And we tackled those 4 big C's that prevent women from getting to meetings. Their lack of confidence, the culture that tells you to go home and mind the children. To me, it was all kinds of insults. Were thrown, or we were told we were a cult and that we would grow in each other and disappear. So we had to tackle this issue of confidence and culture, but we also had to tackle the issue of having no cash and having no childcare. And that's where women also form the networks, in protecting each other, in supporting each other, and getting over those 4 capital C's of confidence, childcare, culture, and cash. But first, we decided we needed to get these structures to be more inclusionary. And so we challenged the system changed, agreed that we could stand as a political party, and we became the first women's party in the world to get elected to the actual peace negotiations. We adopted 3 simple principles. So that would be the second message, is that when women get organized and have their networks in place and they get to the table, to keep everything simple. And that brings more women in, because the 3 simple principles we had were human rights, inclusion, and equality. Inclusion meant that we had to talk to the armed groups when no one else was talking to them, that we mediated and facilitated those discussions, but we also reminded ourselves that we were negotiators. There were the big parties at the table, so that was important, that we had a process that wasn't just about the armed groups and the big parties, but civil society, for the first time ever, was now at the table, elected to be at the table. And that group of civil society representatives were all women. And we had equal speaking rights. So again, what did you do? So now you have the process in place. What's the second thing? What's the substance? What's the meat? Had we not been at the table? That's the question. Had we not been at the table, there would have been nothing on victims, on reparations, on how to deal with the conflict that we've been through in terms of truth and justice. There would have been nothing, no clause would have been written into that peace agreement under the human rights section. And the clause said the right of women to full and equal political participation. That was 1998, 2 years before the UN resolution. We proposed to have a citizens' assembly because we knew that civil society make peace much quicker than politicians and armed groups. And we said, alongside our parliament, there should be a citizens' assembly. We called it a civic forum. It was a new way to bring outsiders inside the system. We had proposals to change the education system. What do women focus on? They focus on what makes for sustainable peace. We proposed an integrated education system. I myself had known nothing but segregation. We lived in a very sectarian society, in which we went to separate schools. And today I'm glad to say we have integrated education. Not as much as I would like, but there is no doubt that we are moving in that direction. Allowing people to share housing and social housing where it was completely segregated. In your previous talk with Lima, I heard Cora Weiss asking this issue about security and the meaning of security. What we did at that table was translate security, not just about demobilization of weapons, physical security, or the allowing prisoners to be reintegrated back into society, or the whole demobilizing of the armies back into their barracks, into their military establishments, and sometimes even out of the country. That's physical security, bringing down the peace walls. But we also talked about social and economic security, the things that you know and we know for women that sustain peace. We wrote into that peace agreement resources for young people to give them aspirations for the future that were different from seeing themselves as the low-hanging fruit of the paramilitaries. And we lived in a very strongly patriarchal society, and indeed what we called an armed patriarchy, and indeed an ecumenical patriarchy in many ways too, because we had many of the churches telling us what to do. And so when you talk about a transition or a transformation, these are the important issues that also need to be part of that, so that gender-based violence does not continue. We wrote a community development proposals into the agreement, that communities could have a sense of ownership. Lima talked about UN 1325 not being translated down into the grassroots. So we argued for a bottom-up women's movement and a bottom-up peace movement. And that came into the agreement. And we got a Bill of Rights. I did not know that I would one day become the Chief Commissioner for Human Rights and the person who would draft that Bill of Rights, the advice on the Bill of Rights. And I continued to write in the rights of women. And by then, UN 1325 had been passed. 2 years later in 2000. And when I became that Chief Commissioner and drafted the Bill of Rights, I wrote in the very clauses that were in the Security Council resolution to argue in the preamble to show that the world had changed and that women were now to be included. I have read as an academic many of the criticisms of UN Resolution 1325, and many of them are justified. The fact that national action plans took too long, the fact that there wasn't enough accountability to see how they were translated into policy decision makers, how women were still not represented in the percentages that they should be. But I've lived long enough to see the difference that it has made. In the election next Thursday here in my own country, at least 50% of the candidates are women. And the next parliament, we expect 40%. We never had affirmative action, but we do have UN 1325. And it eventually made the male politicians sit up and take note. They could no longer do the same old, because we had a movement that was pushing them, and they also became opportunistic enough to know that you don't make peace without women, but it's not good to have only white, male, pale, stale faces staring down at you from the lampposts during the election. So despite all the criticism, and indeed the fact that it ended up UN 1325 focusing a lot on sexual violence, and not perhaps as much as we would have wished on many of the other issues on participation and representation that we had initially set out as our goals. And I do still work on the issues of gender-based violence. I've written 2 reports on what difference does peace make when you take the weapons out of the hands of the armed combatants. And I worry about Ukraine now, which is awash with weapons, and how they will one day have to reconstruct their society. And again, I would say, having watched Ukraine and watched what happened to us, is that you can go backwards as well in terms of participation of women. You get a clap on the back for all the good work you do during a war. But once the negotiations happen and the implementation of those negotiations and all that is promised has to be delivered. So that would be my final lesson, is to make sure that you are there in the reconstruction of your country. And I am 25 years later on this reporting commission, the only woman, still trying to disband or demobilize some of the paramilitary groups that were still left around, who felt that the peace dividend didn't offer them enough, and they kept their structures in place. But in many of the other ways of the country being reconstructed after our terrible, long 30-year conflict, women lost out. And I hope that isn't the case in Syria, where I work with Raja, given the huge work that Raja has invested and civil society has invested, and the work that we invest in transitional justice mechanisms. That we have to be there, not just before or during, but also after. We are ordinary women who fall into extraordinary times. We have expertise. We bring things to the table that do not happen to men. And those are the reasons why we need to be also a part of the reconstruction. So I'll stop there because there's much more that I could say, but I'm more interested in the questions that you have. And so I come to the conclusion in my book about the importance of civil society, the importance of dialogue, the importance of back channels, that you just don't arrive at peace, you build it. But when you make peace, you must also remember that those who made it should also be part of the solution, and that includes women. And that the implementation and validation of any agreement is as important as the agreement itself. And that's where UN 1325 still has to stay on the table, where the action plans have to be meaningful, and where accountability for putting into place what was agreed is held up, and where we say, you haven't met this target, you did not do this timetable. But everywhere I go, I see that they do it for prisoner releases, they do it for army reconstruction, they do it for all what Swanee has called the hardware, and they often forget about the software. And those have to be brought together. And that remains the issue that we still struggle with here, and I'm sure in Syria and everywhere, that you have to have the twin track approach. And that then means that you have social and economic justice sitting alongside accountability for crimes that have been committed. So thank you for that. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Thank you so much, Monica, for all your wisdom and the lesson learned that you shared with all the participants in this event, and like coming together as women, like having simple messages, and also having a united messages as well, to bring in all actors, talking with different actors, and make sure that who is on the women who are making peace also continuing implementing the peace agreement, and all the actors, and make sure that like all the difference that 1325 has made in different area, it is important, but also it's important to make sure that we are increasing the impact of 1325 and advancing, especially on the woman participation. So thank you so much for all your wisdom that you shared. And now, like, we will open the floor for the participant in the call for questions, comments, and I don't see any hands. So actually I do see. So maybe I will start with Majida Zinon, please.
Hi, and hello, Monica. Nice to see you again, even if it's just virtually. We've met in Cyprus a few times.
Oh, yes. Hello. Great
to see you too. My question is, why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still having this conversation about why it's important to have inclusive decision making at every level, not only at peace level?
Because it's still absences from the table. And, you know, now we've got youth peace and security. And people realized that young people's voices were also absent. So I always say that it's for a whole lot of different reasons that we deliberate on these issues different from men, because the issues that affect our lives are different. So we bring those issues. Swanee mentioned cancer earlier. Well, how would you have a health meeting without women talking about the types of cancer they experience? So it's the same for peace building. But representation, I'd like to see more Magnas in Cyprus, in major decision-making roles. And often I'm still asked to go on TV here practically every day because we have an election. And I tell the journalists, you need to find more women. And they say, oh, we don't have very many, or we can't find them. Either they're very lazy or they haven't got the data bank in place. And they don't actually look up their address book and say, oh, it's just men, I must ring Monica, the one token woman. And that has to stop. So for all of those reasons, and it's good for young women now to come up to me in the street and say, I'm so glad you did what you did, because I'm now going to do something. I'm going to stand for election. Count me in. So if you don't have role models to break the ground, outsiders to become insiders, as I used to say, then you will remain very marginalized. But Magda, I think the most important thing of all is it's not just numbers. We have to be promoted into decision-making roles. We have to have influence, because that's how you change laws and that's how you change policies. And I know that from my 40 years of work on domestic violence, that had I not done that work, had I not got to the policymaker and become a policymaker myself and a legislator at one stage, we wouldn't have had the coercive control laws, the stalking laws, the violence against women in the home strategies. So those are the reasons why, and whether it's through UN 1325, which doesn't actually have as big an impact in the global north as it does in the global south, or whether it's through women's movements like yours in Cyprus and building coalitions as you've done, it doesn't matter. We just have to keep asking, why and where are the women? And why are they not here today at this table?
And we also need to remember that it's not just the woman, it's the gender perspective.
Yeah, but it's also progressive women.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's got to be a woman that's aware of.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have a big issue here, as you do in your country and every country, on reproductive rights. And we've got quite a lot of women standing here at the minute against those women who are talking about the need for dignity in relation to that issue. So it's a very divisive debate. And sometimes the men love to see the women fighting amongst themselves, which is very sad. But I have learned that I do not want Margaret Thatcher quoted to me as an example. You know, there was a conservative woman who pulled the ladder up behind her and actually created enormous difficulties for women in the country on low income. And she isn't an example of a role model of women. So when we talk about UN 1325, we have to talk about progress, and we have to talk about a critical mass of women, not just a single one who everyone can roll off their tongue as making it to the top.
So, thank you. Maybe I can move to Ed. I see raising hand, Ed, then Bina Sarwar, and then Barawesh. So Ed, we can start with you first. Maybe, if not, maybe I can, Bina Sarwar.
Yes, hello, hi, thank you so much. And I really apologize for coming in so late. I just saw a reminder pop up about this, and I hadn't saved. It's just bad organization, and I'm really, really sorry. I hope this is recorded and I can see the first part of the talk. But one of the reasons I really wanted to join, besides being able to see Swanee again, who we really miss here in Cambridge, Swanee, please come back, is that I'm so interested in the Irish peace process. I'm from Pakistan, and I've been working on India and Pakistan peace issues for the last 20, 30 years on and off. Like, I'm a journalist basically, and I work as a journalist. I'm not in the policy, whatever. But recently last year we started another initiative to bring it into a regional fold, a South Asia Peace Action Network, so that we stop butting heads, because these are two nuclear armed powers, as you know, and it's just we're holding the whole region, maybe even the whole world hostage because of the way that our leadership, mostly men, have behaved. And I've been looking at how we can learn from the Northern Ireland peace process to see what we can do in India and Pakistan. And I wonder if this is something that you have looked at, or that something that you can offer some thoughts on besides. And I'm again so sorry that I missed the first part of your speak.
Not at all. You're a busy woman, and like all of us, juggling. So I have written this in my book. Everyone says when you write a book, you should remind the audience that the answer lies in the book. I'm joking. But the answer is on the book. Why did Northern Ireland become such a model in terms of conflict resolution? It's a very different conflict here. We don't have like what Raja and I used to talk about, which was barrel bombs from the air, which Ukraine has. And we didn't have, missiles being fired at us, which is your worry in terms of Pakistan and...
No. It's not about the missiles. Sorry.
No. I meant nuclear weapons.
Well, that's like what the biggest problem is, I think, that unlike United States and Canada, for example, or unlike the EU, where even France and Germany, who were enemies for centuries, people can trade, travel, meet. The problem with India and Pakistan, I don't think there's an immediate danger of nuclear weapons, but the problem is they don't allow the people to meet. There is no visas. There's a 90-year-old woman wanting to visit her home, and she was refused a visa. And they've just now, I asked the foreign minister who's just come in, and she very kindly has, but that's just one story. There's thousands, millions.
I get your point.
Yeah.
And my point was equally, every context is different.
Yeah.
And that story that you've just told about the passport is the reason why women have to be at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And Raja knows that passport issue in terms of Syria. Because I think, Raja, you and I communicated about this issue that only men could pass on. In some countries, only men can pass on the inheritance or the legitimacy to their children. Well, how in heaven's name are you meant to have a transformation if you don't change that particular law in relation to inheritance, that the same men before the war will remain the same men afterwards, passing on legitimacy to their children when actually quite a lot of the men are killed in the war. And so those are the reasons why people like you and others need to be either mediators or facilitators or negotiators, because you're raising issues that many others don't see as relevant or important. Now, the other question you asked is, how do you create a scenario for meetings? And that's what Swanee did through her exchanges. Sometimes you can't have them inside the country. We couldn't do them inside our country. Our enemies wouldn't speak to each other. In fact, they took a great pride in thinking it was a strength not to speak to each other at the negotiating table. And we women used to say to them, how in heaven's name do you expect to reach a compromise, to get to consensus on the way forward for all of us to live peacefully in this land, in this divided island, if you don't talk to each other? It's an actual strength to understand the other opponent or protagonist or whoever. And actually one day they may no longer be your enemy, as we discovered in our island here. But there are things that also stop people. I mean, we're in a crisis at the minute, but anybody that's lived through conflict will always know that you will face crises that you hadn't expected. Ours is called Brexit because the UK has left here, and it has created an enormous constitutional crisis for us on this one island. So all I'm saying to you is your context is different. Your path to resolution is probably going to be similar. And that's the message that I write about in the book. And I talk about Cyprus, I talk about Syria, I talk about Bosnia, all of the conflicts that I have engaged with women in, and talk about what I learned from them. So today I may be sitting here talking about what you could learn from Northern Ireland, but believe me, there are many who can learn from you about what works and what does not work. And that's the importance of having these discussions today, and the importance of having what Swanee did, which was to set up that network. I came back from those meetings actually thinking, I can make this into a proposal now. I have an idea. I can draft this into a clause. Let me test it. Let me see how this works. Let me create some back channels. Who do I know on the other side that I can pick up the phone to? Where can I have a meeting where there won't be a photographer reporting about who I've just met? And of course, now we didn't have the internet back then, but now with the internet, it's more possible.
Yeah,
So,
we've been having these meetings for the last year on the last Sunday of every month since the last year. And yesterday we had one on labor rights and democracy in South Asia ahead of May Day. So we've been taking up all kinds of issues. Next month we'll be talking about road safety as a public health issue across the region, that kind of stuff. We're just like doing that. So thank you. I think you given me some great insights.
And I love the idea that you're talking about South Asia, because it's much bigger than just, sometimes you make your issue bigger and you put more issues on the agenda, which takes the pain out of your little close issue. And that's why so many women across the world now are forming regional coalitions. That, like you did in, Magda knows about these in the Mediterranean. And the Balkans have a similar group of women, and no doubt the Middle East, I hope, will one day get a stronger one. So, and that's what we did. We started with a small coalition and then built it into a much bigger one.
Great. Thank you so much for this conversation. And actually, we are realizing while we are working on the Women, Peace and Security events that, like, also as much as we are able to bring the localized approach is essential. And here, like, we are very happy to have you with us, Monica, today to talk about your experience, but also the experience from that, like, you have from other countries as well, because sharing information and, like, basically women exchange with each other and also with decision makers have made a difference before. And this is like one of the lessons that we are learning, that collective learning is very essential. And actually, this is our last event in the spring semester, but during the fall, we are going to focus on Southeast Asia, and we are very happy to communicate further, like to bring the lessons from Southeast Asia as well during the fall. So I hope everyone stay with us back then.
And Raja, can I say something about the power of collectives?
Yes, please.
It's very, very difficult to be in a collective when you have different political viewpoints. But the strength is that you are getting to hear a viewpoint that you would not have heard had you not formed that collective or that coalition. And that's why I constantly push people to say it may take longer for you to get consensus on a decision, but it is time well spent. Mandela taught us that in South Africa when we came as negotiators to a military camp. We were locked up for 3 days. And he said, what you need to remember when you're making peace is you don't make it with your friends. You make it with those you disagree with, or you make it with those who were your enemies. And it was a very simple thing to say, but very profound. And I know for you in Syria, that has been a big issue. Who to talk to? Who can you trust? Whose word is good? Who can I reach out to on the other side? And the more that you can bring into your circle, the better. And that has been a hard process for me. because all of us are brought up in single political identities. But in my life, I've had to reach out to those who came from a different identity than mine. And I hope I became a wiser person as a result.
I think that's the biggest advantages of the regional networks. You actually hear something that would never have occurred to you, or you hear something that unsticks you. Because if you keep on speaking to the same people, it's like a broken record. But if you hear someone that gives you a fresh view of something that might not be related to your conflict, it actually can jumpstart your thinking process. Very big advantage with regional networks.
So how much we are able to have like a diverse group and inclusive actually security, this is like how we can move forward. So maybe we can hear the question or comment from Ghalia. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Ghalia Golan, please.
Hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. I was really very pleased to hear both Magda and Monica talk about which women, because that's the big issue. I always add the 1325. It's not just numbers, it's which women are we putting there? And that goes to, Monica, you mentioned some of the things that women bring to the table that are different from what men bring. I mean, our daily lives are different, so our concerns may be different. I wanted to ask you though, I'm running a project, an international project now on how women negotiate. And I wonder if you could, I know I asked you this question maybe 20, 30 years ago when we met. It was at a dinner and I was sitting next to you and I do remember it. I don't remember the answer. And maybe after all these years, the answer would be different. But did you find, have you found that women, the process, the way in which they engage, not just the topics, but the process may be different?
Galia, it's great to see you after all these years. And I do remember you so well. And you are great, a great woman. Yeah. We design and think about the process differently, but also the substance, as I said. And we have different, what I did, I can only talk about what we did. So we formed the coalition of very diverse women, you know, women who had university educations and those who had left school at 15, women from rural areas as well as urban, and Catholic and Protestant, and women from different ethnic backgrounds. Because people talk about inclusion, but sometimes it's only a binary that they talk about in terms of the other side, whereas there are many sides to a conflict. And we thought about that a lot in terms of the process. We also tested ourselves on that human rights principle. There were some very tough cases, as you would find in the Middle East, where we had to stand up. And what we did was we sent a woman from the other side of the community to speak about the human rights of the person on her opposite side. And it really blew the public wide open when they saw this happening. And it was very brave women, very brave, who did that, because women don't have security guards at their houses. And we worried about their windows getting broken. And indeed our windows were broken, but we still went on speaking bravely when these big politicians wouldn't have the guts to do it. And so again, we got a lot of votes as a result of that. We called it out, Galia. We called out the hypocrisy. We called out the egos. We called out the nonsense that was being talked, the waffle that was going on. And again, it didn't make us popular with the other negotiators, but it made us probably more popular with the public, who were absolutely frustrated and wanted a different, new voice. We were also creative. When the men said, why? We said, why not? And so we put them on the back foot, having to explain why they couldn't include these ideas of ours. We broke down into teams because some women don't have a problem with public speaking and didn't want to do the public stuff. Others were experts at it. Some were brilliant writers, and so we got them to do the drafting. Some spent their time building exchanges internationally so that they could learn from other agreements that had been signed and would bring forward proposals to the table and show them. Others were influencers in their own communities. And so that's the coalition we built, a coalition of skills that were very different for different women. As they say, different strokes for different folks. And one of the things we did, Galia, was to have joint leaders, 2 leaders. I was one, and there was another woman from the other community. So we had joint leadership, which again, the negotiators found difficult, that there wasn't, because there is a cult of the leader amongst many of these big male parties. And that cult in itself is a problem, where they always talk about, I must go back to my leader. Instead of thinking that some of those ideas need to be created through consensus with other leaders, and we saw many of our women as leaders. And I did not want to be what I would say was the cock on the walk. If I broke a leg, I said to the other women behind me, you have to step into my shoes. So we did a lot of training with all of our teams of women in the coalition, so that any one of them in a particular field of expertise, or in terms of if I couldn't be at the negotiating table that day, we had just as good a woman to take my place. And those are the things I think are different. But I write about that in the book as well. What is it that women do differently? And I told you that had we not been at the agreement table on the night of Good Friday in 1998, that agreement would not have been as comprehensive. It wasn't just a case of it being inclusive. It was a case of it being comprehensive. And that's why we got through the referendum. And I have to tell you, it was the women who took to the streets and went to the people and said, you must say yes. We hired buses. We put our children on the buses, and we drove those buses from village to village. And we stood on the corners with megaphones and explained and translated the agreement to the local people. And we looked around to see where the men were. We couldn't find them. Where were they? They were back in their offices getting ready for power, getting ready for government. We were out on the streets explaining line by line what the agreement meant to them. And we were fortunate that the people did say yes. 3/4 of the people said yes. So, we didn't care about getting elected again. I actually call myself an accidental politician. I accidentally fell into politics. I accidentally fell into the negotiating table, and I accidentally fell into the parliament. But I would have just been as happy to fall accidentally back out again. Because there is a life after, politics. And I did get elected to the parliament. But it wasn't the Women's Coalition's biggest goal. It was to make the peace agreement work. Whereas the politicians that we discovered, their biggest goal was to get elected into those powerful offices. And that's what they were focusing on. So, women do things differently. Not all women, by the way, as you well know. There's nothing essential in our bloodstream that says that we all do this, because there are many different women. And this is something the men often love, is when we have disagreements. But we're not a homogeneous group. We are heterogeneous. We are diverse. And that's why I think the skills of trying to reach consensus is something we understand. We do it in our homes with our partners. We do it with our children. And so when we got to the negotiating table, we didn't find it that difficult to do it with the other parties. So those are just parts of the things that we learned and put to good use.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, sorry for the unmute. So I see that Mariana Sen has, you can go ahead. and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here in the midst of these gallant women globally. And I just had a contribution towards the participation of young women with regards to peace and security that was raised. As you could see, I'm from Africa, I'm from the Gambia. Actually, lately there is a lot of young women that are into the advocacy of peace and security, especially when it comes to women political inclusion. But the challenge with young people all over, it's the fact that the space is not that conducive. Because there are a lot of challenges that come even for established women that are already into the space, much more the ones that do not actually have that strong footing. Resources are challenges, we have cultural barriers, but also the amplification of their voices is still not as it should, because quite a lot of them do not have mentors that could actually lend hand to pick them up, which I believe need to be looked into by most of you that are here. Probably if one person can mentor one person, as Monica had already said, it would definitely go a long way. And I agreed with the fact that you said situations differ and every country have its own challenges in a different way. But then globally, to be able to make that much impact and actually bring the young people into the advocacy, I think the issue of mentorship need to be looked at, especially with the advent of social media. We can always connect everywhere. This is the contribution that I have, and I want to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariama, for that, because there also is too much of a stereotype about young women that needs to be torn up, and about young men. Young men are seen as angry and, you know, potentially the recruits for the next conflict. Actually, young men are very skilled and can see how peace is also made, as are young women. And young women are portrayed as being passive, you know, sitting and listening, or just going to do what they're told. Most of the young women I see are fantastic activists, especially on climate change, and they need to be there. So you're making the same point as me, but it is very difficult to, well, we have great feminist young women now in our country, as I said, who are prepared to stand even further up the line, and very young ones standing now for election. I am so delighted when I drive or walk and look up the lampposts at these posters at the moment. And these beautiful young women are staring down back at me. Now that's an image I never thought I would see. And they're articulate and confident. But we, as we say, it's not just building the capacity amongst those young women, it is also changing the structure. And whether that's through affirmative action or quotas. And we still haven't got to that point of saying that we should set a number of seats aside for young people to be there. But those are really important conversations. But too often they only are included because people say, oh, the next generation's a real worry for us because they might go back to war. And that's not the reason to invite them.
Thank you. So maybe we can hear from Jacqueline Nolan.
Hello. Very touching to hear, particularly that last scene described about going around with megaphones, and without that campaign and just going out there on the street, that the referendum may not have passed. I come originally from Dublin, from a working class area in Dublin. I now live in Amsterdam, and I work as a leadership and personal development facilitator. Recently, I was attending open days at universities with my son, and then I decided to go back and do a master's, and I did it in international relations. And I did my thesis on looking at Northern Ireland from a multidisciplinary perspective, bringing in a lot of the behavioral lenses from social psychology and psychology, the ones that are used in my work. And if I'm giving a training, and particularly nowadays, if we're looking at leadership, we're often looking at it from which values and belief systems and deeper needs and fears drive behavior. So you know, it's like an iceberg, the behavior is visible and what's all underneath. And when I was just writing a thesis, and I came across a French Jewish political scientist, Dominique Moisy, and he talked about the geopolitics of emotion in a book from 2010, maybe 2011, the English language version. And I was wondering, could you kind of, what would it be feasible or realistic to think of having, before you get down to the substance and the content and even the substance that women bring in, to have some type of session where you're not talking about prisoners or borders, but where you talk about what's going on underneath the feelings. So, and drawing on Moisy, that even something as simple a framework as is your humiliation, you know, looking at Ukraine now, why is Putin doing what he's doing? What's behind it? Do we want to talk about the Holodomor, the Ukrainian Holocaust?
Can I briefly respond, Jacqueline? Because I know we're nearly out of time. That's really important. Everybody brings their emotions to the table. We were the only women at the table. I was very conscious that we were not seen as the emotional women at the table. But we said, and this is what happened for 2 years, nothing but venting went on at that table. Accusations, insults, hurts being flung across the table. I was the recipient of many of them, actually, because I was challenging some of the thinking. But what happens at the table is people hurt each other, and then the goalposts go higher, and then you've got to try and take the goalposts back down. Then there's rumors, then there's lies. So all of those things happen in negotiations. And then what you need is debriefing afterwards. That's why you need facilitators. And facilitators in particular who can translate those lies, that they're not true, that breaks down the fiction, because you will know that journalists outside sell newspapers built on lies and rumors, and that makes the conflict worse. So you need to have some truth tellers in there, but you also have to have people working on the emotions. So we vented for 2 years. And some people say that you need to have that venting, but actually it wasn't good because people then just walked away and refused to speak to each other. What we should have had was retreats and residentials where you can go away quietly with no journalists standing outside, and simply maybe over a dinner or over some kind of social occasion, which is what eventually we did in South Africa. We got to see the humanity in the other person.
Yeah.
You often can see the legitimacy in the other person, but you may not see the humanity in the other person, because you won't be at a negotiating table if you don't believe the people at the table are legitimate in terms of being there. But do they have the humanity? Do you have enough humanity to see their interests are as important as your interests? And that's obviously, I mean, Raja and I and many others will know exactly what that's like. That's why I loved, Raja, when I did some of the training workshops with you, when some of the most painful stories I ever heard, but women cried through them, and when they were telling about their time in detention. And yet when I do some of those workshops with men, they find it much more difficult to talk about what happened to them. And yet it was very powerful for us to set time aside, especially when they were talking about the intimate partner violence or sexual violence. But often I found the men in our negotiations had a hard time dealing with emotions. And they found it much easier to deal with insults. But once you open up a space, and I think that's good that you're looking at that, because no one ever, well, they do, that's wrong to say no one, but too often we don't look at the behaviors and we don't look at the emotions. We just stick to the hard substance that has to be negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
And so the relationships, to me, the chemistry is everything. In the end, we signed a peace agreement because we finally got the chemistry right. And it was the emotional chemistry that was right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Monica. It's very, I mean, during the work that we have done, like especially in Syria, but also other places, like with women, like working, like one of the techniques that we used actually, and was in cooperation with Inclusive Security, where does it hurt? And it was like very, very essential, like to break actually into the real essence of what we need to have in the agreement, or in, like you said, shared principles, symbol messages that we need to agree on. And in order to get that, like this is in 2014 and 2015, women had to say like what they went through. Like women had lost their sons, or like they were in detention. Women like were under siege, almost like losing their like family members or themselves for hunger in Syria, or from bombing, like sharing what they went through air bombing. And I do think that now, like in Ukraine, women in Ukraine, and actually all people in Ukraine needs to have the space to tell their story as well, in order to be able to involve in more effectively in peace and security. So thank you for sharing that, Monica. And we can hear from Pamela Humphrey now for the questions or comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Monica. This has just been inspirational. There were a number of, well, one statement, and I just picked up a book called Say Nothing. Do you know about Patrick Keefe? And I'm struck by it, to your point, is that you're not even mentioned in the, and I'm thinking, you know, because it's supposedly, it's focused on the leadership during the Troubles and what happened to them and that whole process and the participants. But I'm struck by the fact in the quote aftermath, the aftermath was really what happened to them. And I'm just, the absence of any kind of discussion in that book about the aftermath and what happened is very absent, which I find terribly disappointing. But in any case, I picked up the book because I really wanted to try to understand the dynamics of what went on for so darn long in that horrible situation. The second thing is, are you in touch with any women's groups in Ukraine? And the other is that I really value your commitment and understanding of the importance of walking into someone else's shoes in order to get to yes. And the whole emotional thing, men have emotions as well. And I think human nature is you want to be validated. You want to be validated. And the critical piece, whether you disagree or agree, is that I think people need to be validated in order. I mean, I just know in my own life, if I feel validated, I can breathe and then move on. The minute you're not validated, you fight harder to be heard. And so I value your perspective on that. And the other thing is, among women, how critically important it is, in my opinion, to not invalidate women that the collective, whoever the collective is, disagree with.
Yeah. Okay. First, in relation to Say Nothing, I know the book. And it isn't remarkable that he doesn't refer to the work that the Women's Coalition did. I actually was one of the key people behind the negotiations of the families of the disappeared. I've been working for 25 years on getting those bodies recovered. Yeah. And in fact, every year we meet on Palm Sunday, which we did 2 weeks ago. And many of the bodies are recovered. But the family that he speaks about in his book are not even happy with the way he wrote the book. Yeah. But never mind, it's a good book. It's sold millions. But here's what I said in my book. And 2 reasons why I wrote the book was because in the parliament, I had been told, and in the negotiations, too many times to shut up and sit down. So I called my book Stand Up and Speak Out. And I open it up with that, explaining why I did not shut up and sit down. Because that's what, and I was told, and I had children. So it was quite humiliating to be covered on television. Shut up and sit down, you silly woman. But in the book, I tell a very funny story about my kids. When I came home, the youngest, who was only 6, said, Mom, that is terrible what they're saying about you. But it's a beautiful evening. And I do think you're a little bit silly putting me to bed at 6 o'clock in the evening. I tell in the book the reality of being a mother, as well as a politician, and all of the emotions. But here's what I say in the preface to my book. My intention with this book is to leave behind my record of those times, and also to correct some of the inaccuracies that I have found in a number of other accounts of the peace process in Northern Ireland, particularly those of male commentators and historians who do not think what women did was important enough to document. I hope this book will help people to gain a deeper understanding of the work of peace building, why it matters to have women at the table, and how seeing the humanity in each other can lead to transformation. So that's the first point about what you said. The second about validation, really important. When you train negotiators, you train them to listen. What is that person trying to say? And as long as what they're saying is truthful and not, you know, a rumor or a lie or a fiction, then it's important to say, I hear what you're saying. Let me see if I've got it right. And rephrasing it in a way that everyone around the table can then hear it. And that's how you get to negotiate. And then your point about, the final point I think you made is to make sure that you don't leave women feeling excluded when you form a collective. And that's quite hard. But in response to you and to Raja, storytelling is crucial. And you should have a parallel process or civil society group, as we do here, called Healing Through Remembering. And it's a storytelling group. And it's about healing as well as remembering. But what I want to say to you is this, is that you then need to get beyond the story.
Right.
And say, what do I need as an outcome in terms of the story I've just told?
Exactly.
And what I found when women came to me to tell me their stories, I had to ask the question, what do you need me to do? For? And then they could articulate it. But too often they don't come, as the Americans would say, what's your ask? And I had to learn that. What's your ask? So, and Raja and I, in our training, we heard these stories, and then we'd sit up to midnight thinking, now what do we need to do to make that a proposal?
Right.
And sometimes when I used to go into these meetings, I could see the men beginning to yawn when they heard too many stories.
Yeah.
Because what they wanted was you to get to an outcome.
Right.
And so during the negotiations, we had these things called confidence building committees. And in those confidence building committees, we took those stories and then brought them into the committee and drafted a paper on what needed to be done. And I think that's a good lesson for this and for other people in these situations.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for those lessons learned, actually. So maybe there was like a message on the chat. I'll have it as like one last question to you, and we can hear from you your last comments as well. Do you think that we should move with a new resolution on women, peace and security, and especially focusing on like 50% quota representation for women? Or like what's like on the international level, like what's your advice on advancing women, peace and security in general? Is it the new resolution or other actions as well?
I think we probably have the resolutions. There are so many of them attached to 1325 now. So it started out as one, and then the iteration became more and more. And it's not the resolution, it's its implementation. And that's where you have to have the accountability. Who has been responsible in your country for implementing that resolution? Because it applies to all of the UN affiliated countries. So that's the question. Get an implementation committee. And most countries have them now, either through a national action plan, and if they don't, then through an implementation process to make sure it's translated into affirmative action. Now, your question about affirmative action is a good one. I'm a believer in affirmative action, but we don't have it here because we have the UK system that refuses to have quotas. And I'm astounded when I go to the Middle East and to Africa and see how easy it is for them to have a certain percentage, or every third woman it has to be a man or a woman on the election list. And Scotland has a good system now where it has a separate list system called twinning. For every man, there has to be a woman. And hence the reason why the Scottish Parliament has so many women in it. But as a result of the resolution, Northern Ireland has managed, the political parties themselves have now had to put women up the list into safer positions, or also have a percentage on their executive without having a mandated quota. And isn't it interesting, Raja, that in our reform of policing, and again, I had to stand up and speak out, in the reform of policing, which was really important in every society, after you make a peace agreement, you have to look at security sector reform. They had a quota, and 50% of all new recruits had to be Catholic. And it was allowed under the European legislation directives, because it was an underrepresentation of that group. And I stood up and said, well, can we please also have the same for women? And they said, oh, no, the war wasn't over women. It was over sectarianism. But as a result of having that quota, more women came into the police. And today we call it a police service, not a police force. And many other reforms happened as a consequence of that representation. So there are other ways of coming at this, but it's really important to work out what kind of affirmative action works in your country. And as you say, the United States doesn't agree with quotas, other countries do. And here we found other ways around it, where we insist on all public appointments, there has to be 40% of one gender or the other, 60-40. And so we mandate that. And that's really important because we have a lot of good regulatory commissions here. We have a Human Rights Commission, an Equality Commission. We have a police ombudsman. All of these bodies that were set up as part of the peace process, all of these institutions that were set up post-conflict to make sure that we had an accountable government. And I said that the people on these commissions needed to be reflective of our society. And they couldn't all be men as they were before, which was the status quo. Therefore, we should have 60-40. And it passed. And it has passed now for religion, for political identity, for we have a whole series of equality provisions, and it's written into our legislation. And we had an agreement in 1998 that even talks about disability, responsibility for carers, sexual orientation, ethnicity, as well as religion. And I was very proud to sign off on that agreement because most people only wanted us to talk about religion. And that wasn't the country I was looking forward to living in. I wanted to see that other diversity of discrimination being represented and the equality provisions brought in to tackle those as well.
Monica, I hate to interrupt just quickly, but one question that I did have is, are you in connection with anybody in Ukraine?
Yes, you asked me that. Yes. I've been involved with Ukrainians in the past after 2014 war. And my colleague who set up the Women's Coalition with me works with a group in Ukraine, in fact, in Odessa. But yes, we have connections, and I'm currently hosting a family in my sister's house and here in my own home, a mother and a 12-year-old who came from Ukraine last week as refugee.
Wow.
There are 33,000 now in Ireland, and I live in Northern Ireland, where it's been a much slower process of families who put themselves like me forward to bring a family into my home. And it's much slower for us to find families because the UK have insisted on ridiculous restrictions and visas. But yes, through that connection and through our women's connections, we are connected to women in the Ukraine.
Oh, that's good news.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much
Can I say
Monica,
something?
for sharing that. And unfortunately, we finished our time, but like it's a good place to finish and like to recognize that how it's important now, like to support women in Ukraine in advancing women, peace and security agenda. And this is where like we encourage everyone actually like to tap into like different knowledge and expertise of women leaders around the world who have been advancing women, peace and security, such as our great guest today, Professor Monica McWilliams. Thank you so much for being with us. And finally, I would like to thank the organizer, the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and all the team members who have been behind the scene, who is helping, and also the leadership of the center, and also for the sponsor for our events, the Inclusive Security, the United Nations Association of the USA, UNA USA, and the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Thank you so much, Monica McWilliams, for this great deep discussion. And thank you for all the work that you have done and currently doing to support women leaders around the world and support better inclusive decision-making mechanism for peace and security around the world.
Thank you. And can I just ask?
Yes,
to,
absolutely.
Send the link to the book, and I'm more than happy to continue talking to people who are interested.
Great.
It's on Amazon, but I don't like to promote Amazon for obvious reasons. It's in the bookshop. And
yeah, thank you for that, Monica. And we will share the link for the book, and also we will with the email to all the people who register for the event. And thank you all for participating in this event. Stay tuned with us for receiving not only the link for the great book Stand Up, Speak Out of Monica McWilliams, but also the recording of this event, which will be posted on the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies website. Thank you all,
Monica, for your pragmatism.
Thank you all.
God knows.
I just wanted to ask Monica if you'd hold the book up again, because I wanted to get a picture of you holding up the